Welcome to Social Work Talks. I'm your host, Lori Appleton. This episode of Social Work Talks is brought to you by Project ID. So listeners, imagine this scene. You're sitting in your clinical office when a call comes in. A wife initiates the call while her husband listens alongside her. Their adult children have not spoken to them in over a year. The parents have pleaded, cajoled, and apologized for all past transgressions, hoping they can make amends. This scenario is not uncommon. Two siblings who no longer speak to each other, grandparents who cannot tolerate how their children treat them, or children who decide they can no longer endure the pain and anguish of disappointment. Family disengagement and emotional splinters are trending upward for a variety of reasons. Our featured presenter will offer us insight into understanding the dynamics associated with family cutoffs and how generations can be impacted by this phenomenon. Margaret Otto, LSCSW, is a licensed clinical social worker with a full-time practice in the Kansas City area. She's been practicing social work since 1989 and specializes in Bowen family systems theory. Margaret is a highly experienced professional who has extensive understanding working with individuals and their families. Margaret is the co-founder and director of KC Center for Family and Organizational Systems. The KC Center began practicing in 1996. Margaret teaches and trains other therapists, family medical residents, clergy, and business owners. She's presented at local, national, and international conferences. Gosh, Margaret, what do you do during your free time?
Not enough.
Yeah, nice, right. Well, welcome to the show, Margaret. So before we jump into the case, I'd like to know a little bit more about you. Can you tell us how and why you became a social worker?
It's a great question. I've really enjoyed my field. I've never had that Sunday night dread, I've got to go to work the next day. And when I think back of it, I lived in Detroit in the 60s during the Detroit riots. And I was at Girl Scout camp and the riots hit. And so kids were getting messages, from families. And everybody came in my tent. And I remember being confused a little bit then about why is everybody in my tent? But I think it just speaks to family process at an early age. And there it is, everybody's in my tent. I didn't know a way to think about it then, but it makes perfect sense. I ended up with the master's in social work. Then I went into medicine. And then went from medicine to mental health in 89. So it's been a great run.
Yeah. It sure makes sense to me because, in family systems, everybody's in your tent, right?
Yes, in more ways than
one. And we'll get to that later. That's right. Oh, gosh. So as your practice evolved, you were interested in Bowen family systems theory. Can you tell us more about the theory and how you utilize it in your practice?
Yeah, I was really fortunate. In graduate school at WashU, we had whole semesters on theories. Not 2 weeks, a whole semester. I didn't have anything on Bowen family systems theory. But after that, I went to Menninger's and did some training there and got more interested and heard Dr. Bowen speak early in Leavenworth. And it just made perfect sense to me. It just was one of those theories that just hit me. And people will describe this. It just makes sense. So then I went out and studied with him shortly before his death. And then Mike Kerr took the realm, and I've been at it ever since.
Right. So you learned from Dr. Bowen and Dr. Kerr, and then from there, you've seen that it makes sense in your clinical practice.
Yes, I applied it. I try to apply it as, it's human as the rest of them, but as everybody, but try to apply it every hour. And not only to my clinical case, but to my own family too, because it doesn't make sense to ask clients to do something you haven't tried or haven't made an effort at. So these are universal issues and challenges, and I've been very happy with my statistics clinically. I used to keep track of them, my suicide rates, hospitalization rates, etc. Then I quit doing it because I was so satisfied with it.
Oh, that's great. That's good to know. So let's take a minute to revisit our case study. The parents are reporting that they have not spoken to their adult children and grandchildren for over a year. From the parents' perspective, they were cut off. So oftentimes they're blindsided. They don't understand, just stereotypically, they don't understand where everybody went and why this is happening. And so what happens in relationships where cutoffs occur?
Well, every family has a version of this. It's just how much. Bowen theory talks about universal processes. So people will experience tension in relationships, right? They can feel guilty. They can feel like they've been treated like a child. They can feel disapproved of. Nobody understands me. Nobody approves of me. And these tensions develop in relationships over generations, and then they have to be coped with. And Bowen created 8 original concepts of how family processes work. I actually wrote them down because I always figure I'll forget one, So triangles, differentiation of self, nuclear family emotional process, the family projection process, multi-generational, and cutoff was one of them, sibling position, societal regression. And then Dr. Kerr added uni disease concept. And over time, the core concepts have become anxiety and differentiation. So anyway, when you get all of these processes happening in families, the tension mounts up. And one way that people cope with tension is they cut off or they distance. And cut off is a term used to describe between generation contact. They cut off between the generations. Parents don't talk to their children or their grandchildren. Distancing is a different concept. Everybody, my gosh, who hasn't gone to a movie and gotten a 2.5-hour vacation, right? Distancing through work or drinking or all the variables is different than cutoff. And cutoff's when generations lose contact or cut off to manage the tension.
Right. Well, there's a lot to learn there for each one of those perspectives, and we're going to talk a bit more about that later in the podcast. And so we'll return to our topic after we pause for a commercial break. Listeners, we'll be right back. 26 million American adults live without a government-issued photo ID. Social workers know this small piece of plastic is the key to unlocking access to the critical tools their clients need to thrive, like employment, housing, and healthcare. Project ID, the nationwide nonprofit leader in successfully obtaining IDs for the people who need them most, invites you to join the next generation of leaders solving America's ID crisis. Project ID Incubator take you from the role of single-handed community support to nonprofit founder and executive director in 8 months. Applications are now open. Are you ready to make a commitment to this cause? Learn more and apply today at projectid.org/PIDI. And we're back. We're back with Margaret, the great Margaret Otto.
I would say the human Margaret Otto.
Human Margaret Otto, of course.
Everybody.
So we were talking about cutoffs. We were talking about distancing. There is also this dynamic that occurs around pressure to reconcile. It's almost like Housewives of Beverly Hills. The whole family comes into play and they're talking to each other and they're all fired up about what the family members should do. And it can be really painful and cause further trauma. What are some strategies you might use to assist the whole family?
Well, I mean, like I mentioned, it's true in every family, and I'll talk some about the cutoffs in my own family, my efforts with that. But families can get together and they can be sort of peace agree families. It looks great. Everybody's polite, but there can be a big undercurrent under it that's uh, pretty uptight. Or families can dissolve into yelling, screaming matches, door slamming, and all of that. Either style of families, there's the tension to deal with. And I think part of it is the beginning process is not to see it in cause and effect thinking. The kids didn't cause the cutoff. I didn't cause the cutoff. My grandmother didn't cause the cutoff. Um, that it's sort of evolved over time, and then the winds or the streams of emotional process sweep up individuals and take them downstream, and sometimes further than they want. You know, when I ask families in here or individuals, I work a lot with individuals, but you know, there's usually a desire to connect and return to better times, but there's no roadmap sort of to do that. Sometimes not. That seems to be more the exception. Um, so I don't know if you want to throw anything in about that. I can describe the cutoff in my own family. This is some of my own early work that I did, but it's a multi-general generational process. But I guess one other point, instead of cause and effect thinking, A created B, it's at least two people, more likely three people, to solve a problem. One of the ideas is in order to solve a problem, you've got to think in threes, at least three people. And sometimes that's really hard to see, Lori. I mean, if you're fighting with your husband or fighting with a kid, I mean, what in the heck? Who is the third person? I mean, really? I mean, it does not feel that way, or seem that way, or if somebody doesn't pick up the phone again, it doesn't seem like there's a third party involved. But if you can get to the top of the stadium and look at it, it's a much different view than being on the field. It's a much different view. And then it gives you more of a roadmap to get more freedom to move around the family however you want. And I just think that's really important to be sort of liberated or free like that, to move anywhere you want.
So often there's a lot of people in the room. Even though there are not a lot of people in the room, you set it up so that people understand that it's not just you. There are three people at least in the room.
At least. And individually, I'll do individual consultations, and they bring in their tribe with them. And I'll draw, you can't see my marker board, but I'll draw the whole emotional system that they're the context that they live in, because humans are social species. We're all connected. And that level of connection determines the individual as much as the individual impacts the system. So I'll draw it out, and that's the beginning, I think, of seeing it in a broader context. All the multi variable processes that happen that impact the individual versus it's somebody's fault. You know, I say this often, but cause and effect thinking is some of the nastiest in the mental health world. You have to either blame somebody else or blame yourself. That neither one of those that is just awful. I mean, it's your fault or my fault. I mean, what? So to have a systems perspective is a way to get out of that kind of entrapment and see it as more the way it really is versus A created B or B created A. And then it just goes back and forth, attack, defend, move, counter move, whatever.
And aren't cutoffs intergenerational? Like if you ask the family, do you know about if your parents have had any cutoffs or your grandparents have had any cutoffs, that you see that there's a connection, that they're cut off somewhere earlier on that then have followed through to the client, that you're seeing?
Yeah, I'll just, talk a little bit about my own family. My grandparents' generation, it's my maternal grandparents. One marriage, solid marriage, didn't look like any overt challenges in the marriage. Two children, oldest sister, youngest sister. And my mother was the youngest and her sister the oldest. And as typical in, nuclear families, one kid gets a little more of the projection process. So one kid gets a little more of the focus. And this is universal. It's not, it just is. Sometimes it's mild, okay, not a big deal. And other times it's pretty heavy. So in that family, the oldest sister, my aunt, my mother's older sister, got the label as more the black hat. And my mother got the label of more the good hat, the white hat. So, okay, that family tools along down the pike, and it's very functional. And grandfather's successful. There's, kids graduate, they marry. But over time, the emotional process starts to come up in a stronger way, and sort of an erosive process.
Mm-hmm.
So then when my grandfather dies first, my grandmother dies second, and she leaves the inheritance in a different manner to the two girls. So because of the difference in the will, right? So classic. I mean, how many times have you heard this story, Lori? I mean,
well, and listeners, this is not new. This is
just 101 family process, right? And so, okay, fine. So then the sisters don't speak, right? Because they weren't quite treated the same. So then I come along, I'm the middle of three, and I graduate and get raised, and, not in a peace agreed family. And then I get married. I'm getting married, and I'm like, now, why don't I talk to my aunt? What is up with that? Because I had memories when I was little. It was great. She could work on an engine just like any man could. She could make the best pot of chili. I had no beef with her. And I'm like, wow. And then I had started just at the beginning of Bowen theory, just Menninger's. I did a female functioning class. Then I went to Georgetown, and I'm like, just at the very beginning, I'm like, and then I realized it was really an issue between my mother and I. I was riding her tailwinds. I mean, she didn't speak, so why would I speak? I hadn't really thought about, well, why am I locked at the hip? Why am I doing that? So so I got married, and I invited everybody to the wedding because I cut off on both my parents' side. Both my father didn't talk to his brother much, and my mother didn't talk to her sister much. I invited everybody. And then I had my
There's that social worker again.
Well, I just started to think different. Why would I just rubber stamp this it wasn't my beef. Why would I just rubber stamp this? So then, fast forward, I have a child, and then in that period of time, my mother got sick, terminally ill. And I thought, again, why is this? Why am I not connected to that family? I mean, I had cousins I knew, and so I told my family I was going to contact her. Well, it didn't go over great.
Yeah.
Let's just say that, my father told me absolutely not. I should not do that. I contacted my cousin. My cousin said I was going to kill my aunt if I contacted her, right?
No pressure. No pressure.
And I'm like, nobody was for it. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it.
Leave things alone.
Leave it as be. Don't. It's a peace agreed family. Don't create a fuss up. So, of course, controversially, I told my cousin that I was going to call her and that and she could give her 24-hour notice so that if there was a health problem, we could get around that. And so I called my aunt the next day, and it was fine. It was just like we'd never talked. And did it make a difference, that much difference to everybody else? I don't know so much, but it made a difference for me. I was able to contact them, stayed in touch, still in touch with that family.
Yeah.
Not gonna ride somebody else's tailwind if I don't have the same beef. My aunts and my sister, my mother did contact prior to her death. Did it make a huge difference? I don't know. They visited. It was fine. It was fine. It wasn't any big hallelujah moment. There was no big consequence out of it except for me. And then I got more freedom to move in the family like I wanted. So I don't know if you have thoughts or questions about that, but that's a very classic story.
Right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your story. And I can't see the listeners, but I can imagine that they're leaning forward, that there's an understanding. And one of the things that you talked about, going back to our title of the podcast, is should I stay or should I go? Your family was saying, don't touch it, leave it alone, don't do anything about it. And you said, no, I want to look at this legacy and I want to look at this intergenerational stuff that I have nothing to do with. And I think I want to, look into this. And that's what happened from that. That's amazing.
Well, they're probably all leaning forward saying, don't do it. Don't do it. What's the matter with you? I mean, it's sort of an outlier position. Why would you? And it may make sense in some families not to. It might be too disruptive. It could be too fragile.
Right.
This thing about getting neutral and getting objective about emotional process. But the idea is, if there's a cutoff, sometimes I think of families this way, and it's probably a weird therapist brain that's been exposed to bone theory. But I think it's like tributaries of water, all the connections, all the evolution of relationships over time. And if you cut them off, like my parents cut basically, two families off to a certain extent, not total. They'd see their family. My father would see his mother once a year. So it wasn't total cut off, but if you decrease the flow of connection, well, it's got to go somewhere. The water's got to go somewhere. And so then there's a shift of symptoms. If there's a cutoff in one area, it can create a shift in symptoms to another area. A marriage, the kid's family, somewhere. It's got to go somewhere. And all of us, have an immature, reactive side, and tension will bubble up somewhere. And so it really doesn't, in a way, it short term, it solves a problem. I can understand why my mother and her sister didn't talk. I mean, why would you want to after that slap in the face, right? I mean, but on the other hand, symptoms were popping up elsewhere. And so that's part of the dilemma, I think. How do you, what's worth it and what's not?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great image. It's a really great image. One of the things that you talked about that I want to follow up on is reunification is not always the best solution. What you did was you invited your family in, even though it was suggested leave it alone. On the other hand, reunification may be a choice that makes the most sense. So how do you maintain your neutrality while helping the client determine their best path forward?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to it. I mean, this is family after family, hour after hour. What is contact about? What type of contact? Sometimes I tell families, well, I mean, I'm a mother and have nieces and nephews and, all that, great nieces and nephew, but I don't know how to unbirth a baby. So I'll just say,
That's just brilliant.
you may not want to talk to them, but you still have a baby. I don't know how to unbirth a baby. So you may not want to deal with your sister or your brother or your cousin or whoever, but I don't know. You still are a cousin. You still are a brother or a sister. And then, they usually laugh and, and I laugh too, because it's like, I don't know how to undo it. But what to do with it is a challenge. And generally, when families do decide to undertake something, they do it carefully, carefully with coaching. They don't go in on a weekend and blow it up. It's careful and with coaching and purposeful. Maybe it starts with the birthday card, or the other common threat is that, if you don't do what I want, Mom, you're not going to see your grandkids. That's a pretty common triangle too, right? I mean, I'm talking same triangle in my family, just working differently.
Well, that's our case study right there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If I disapprove, if you get my disapproval, there's this potential threat. You're not going to see the grandkids. So you have to go belly up to me so you can see the grandkids.
Right.
And pressure to give in or accommodate or go into no self position to, I call it ghosting yourself, not taking a position and then avoiding the threat. And yet there's consequences down the line to that.
Right. Right. What about, you've been talking about systems theory, and many of the people listening don't do systems theory. They see individuals, and it's hard for them to see the whole system. They're thinking more about the individual. So can people who are hearing about family issues, can they help their individual clients?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's crazy in a way to me is that when anybody starts to talk, doesn't matter if it's a client in therapy or a neighbor or a consultation or a doctor, or individuals will talk it. They come in talking systems. My neighbor's talking systems. It's a natural systems theory. People are talking it all the time. They're describing it. And sometimes it's missed because the mindset is trained in a different way. Might be trained more individual and not hear so much what people are saying. But if you listen to what people are describing, well, here's an example. I'll give you another example. I had this is old times, two doctors that referred to in the same clinic. One doctor referred to me a lot. The other doctor, didn't matter what happened, I could not get a referral. I could not understand it. Why do you think the one doctor didn't refer to me? Now, if we had everybody listening, I could hear all their guesses, right? How do you think those two doctors got along?
None.
Right. And I'm like, oh, I knew that. They told me that. It just I didn't hear it.
So the triangle.
Yeah. One's going to refer a bunch to me. The other, I'm never going to get a referral from in the same clinic because I don't get along. They don't see it the same.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's one of the processes. The other is my end of it. What do I do with that? But anyway, I mean, people will describe it and they talk it. And then if you're trained in an individual way, sometimes it's missed because you can't really hear it. You're applying a different perspective on the individual. And I honestly don't care what it is. What I do care about is, and this, when I do presentations, I did one for NASW not too long ago, but I always say, this is my most important slide in my PowerPoints. How you think about a problem determines what you do with it. So if you think medically, you'll be thinking medicine. If you think psychoanalytically, you'll be thinking one way. If you think attachment theory, it's another. My beef is when people don't know the theory they're working off of. I don't care what it is. Any of them can be, founded on research and have interesting things in them. I think Bowen family systems theory is the most comprehensive, but I think it's important to know what leg you're standing on when you're, providing services. So but I don't care which one it is. But how you think about it's going to determine what you do about it.
Right. Well, let's make a little bit of a shift, but still talking about systems theory, because I was coming in to do this podcast, and it occurred to me that this is such a timely um, opportunity to do this topic because our country is splintered right now. And there's a system is a system. So whether it's working individually, whether it's working with couples, whether it's working with families, organizations, now our whole country is splintered and struggling. And so what people do when we're struggling in pain, oftentimes, is reach out. And yet when I think of Dr. Bowen, I think that much of his work was reaching in. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, because we could certainly use your perspective.
Yeah, I remember I just studied under him at the end of his life, and I remember we had some meetings in his home, and I remember his office, and it had so many books from other fields. He was all about learning what was going on in other fields. And he talked about the internal world and made the theory apply to the individual world and the relationship network around the individual. But his focus was so much on other fields. And then Mike Kerr continued that at the Bowen Center in Georgetown and continued that at the Bowen Theory Academy. I have had many a scientist come and speak here, and it's always so interesting that the scientist starts in one end. They don't know the other person's perspective, and then they just almost march together and then they end up on BTA, did a conference on cancer with Margaret Otto's work, philosophy of cancer, and here's Dr. Kerr, and they just end up connecting. So I think the science of human behavior is really important. And to get back to where your focus, one of the original concepts was societal regression. And Bowen described that as a primary concept, in the late 50s, early 60s. And where people are, it's like tribalism against each other. instead of connecting with each other, and also getting more and more permissive over time. So how do you do that? I mean, how do you continue to relate and connect to humans no matter what their religious orientation is, their political orientation? Humans are humans. They all have families. We're all in the same species. And not get into a form of tribalism, if you want, you know, which is, always a pressure, always a pressure. So anyway, I'm rambling on. One other thing I'll think about, I'll throw in, Lori, and then see I'm talking too much. Usually I talk too much on Fridays, but today I'm talking too much maybe on a Monday. I think one of the laments at Dr. Bowen's end of his life, and then her continued, and I think everybody in the field can see that what is it that's so hard about focusing on oneself? What is so hard about that? What does it truly take for somebody to get interested in their own part of the problem? Now, mind you, I say part, because it's not cause and effect. It's not blame. There's 3 people involved, you'd have a third of it, right? You have a third. You have a part to play. It's not responsible for it. It's a part. And then when people can figure that part, whether it's on their neighbors or how they're interacting religiously or politically, then they have the freedom to do something about it. But I think that people get allergic to it because they're so into cause and effect. They think they're going to be blame the family. It's the farthest thing from it. What are you going to do? Go call up my great-great-grandmother and say, why did you marry him? I mean, when I draw it out, how many people? There's always 10 or more, So the lament of what does it take for people to get really interested in themselves and become more self-responsible. Mm-hmm. And that's in some ways what everybody's working on at some level.
Well, that's really helpful. As we begin to wind down, one of the things I take from that is that just like families are generational over time, that our society is generational over time. And in the moment, it feels like it does if you are a child, if you are, let's say, these parents, go back to the case study, and you feel like this is an event. It's happening right now. It's painful. It's a crisis. Yet if you spread it out and you take a bleacher's perspective and you look at the family, then you can see that there is a continuum. And so that relates to society right now. And so I find that really interesting and very helpful, and I think our listeners will as well. Do you have anything that you want to add to that? This has been so useful.
Humans are made to do hard things. Humans can manage a great deal of discomfort and get the twitch out of it, so to speak. Bowen used to say, leave the twitch at the door, Mm-hmm. But they can get the twitch out of it, and they can manage a great deal of discomfort. And people are made to do hard things. And sometimes I think humans forget about that, about themselves, that they can do it. They can do something hard. Because we're made for it. My gosh. I mean, the humans have populated, for better or worse, the entire Earth. They can live in anywhere, the Sahara to the Arctic. Now, we could talk about other dynamics or other consequences of that, but humans are made to do hard things. And sometimes they, I think, forget that to be more self-responsible is freedom. And it gives just, like my little effort with my aunt got me freedom so I could go and visit where I wanted to. I had the freedom in the family to go where I wanted. And nothing really blocked it at that point. Now, did my family move up on the scale of differentiation to some high point? No. I've always said that I was about a 32, maybe a 34. But it was useful for me, even though it was hard. And there are other hard things. But you get a gain for your effort, maybe not short term. Short term, I'm thinking my aunt's going to have a heart attack. If I call her, she might die. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're right. Maybe I shouldn't call her. But long term is much different.
Thank you so much. Thank you for helping us understand the complexities associated with family splintering. There's so many different ways to look at this, and so we really appreciate all that you've shared today. And thank you, listeners, for tuning into this episode of Social Work Talks. For more information about Margaret and the KC Center for Family and Organizational Systems, go to www.kcfamilysystems.org. Listeners, you can find more information about Margaret and our topic in the show notes section of Social Work Talks. Anything else you want to say before we close, Margaret?
No, it's been fun. I'm just working on myself. I don't know about helping others, but just keep trying to lend a hand and work on my own issues. And I've enjoyed it, Lori. It's fun. It's a great field. And actually, social work started with families. The origin of social work at Whole House was with families. So I think it's a lot of fun, and be glad to discuss it anytime or with anybody else that's interested.
Well, thank you so much. And listeners, thank you for listening.
You have been listening to NASW Social Work Talks, a production of the National Association of Social Workers. We encourage you to visit NASW's website for more information about our efforts to enhance the professional growth and development of our members, to create and maintain professional standards, and to advance sound social policies. You can learn more at www.socialworkers.org. And don't forget to subscribe to NASW Social Work Talks wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next episode.